Okay, so we're picking up where we left off, talking about Andrew Jackson. And when we talk about Andrew Jackson, the Indian fighter, we need to talk about Indian removal. Um, it's not exactly kosher to refer to Native Americans as Indian. However, this is a term that is all throughout primary sources and whatnot. So, historically speaking, we can use this term. But I would encourage you to refrain from using it if you actually meet a Native American or one of Native American ancestry. So, early in the 19th century, while the United States was rapidly expanding into the lower South, white settlers faced what they considered to be an obstacle. This area was home to five, we group them together in these groups. There's several tribes, but these sort of five main overarching groups in the South: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. These Indian nations, in the view of settlers as well as many other white Americans, were standing in the way of progress. They're eager for land to raise cotton and build a plantation economy. So the settlers pressured the federal government to acquire Indian territory. Andrew Jackson from Tennessee was a forceful proponent of Indian removal. In 1814, he commanded the U.S. military forces that defeated a faction of the Creek Nation. In their defeat, the Creeks lost 22 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama. And thus he gains the name of the Indian fighter. The U.S. acquired more land in 1818 when, spurred in part by motivation to punish the Seminoles for their practice of harboring fugitive slaves, Jackson's troops invaded Spanish Florida. There it is. From 1814 to 1824, Jackson was instrumental in negotiating 9 out of 11 treaties which divested the southern tribes of their eastern lands in exchange for lands in the west. The tribes agreed to the treaties for strategic reasons. They wanted to appease the government in the hopes of retaining some of their land, and they wanted to protect themselves from white harassment. As a result of the treaties, the U.S. gained control over 3/4 of Alabama and Florida, as well as parts of Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, Kentucky, and North Carolina. This was a period of voluntary Indian migration, however, and only a small number of Creeks, Cherokee, and Choctaws actually moved to new lands. In 1823, the Supreme Court handed down a decision. Sorry for the camera moving. I had an itch on my back. Oh, the fun things you get to experience with Miss Walker. Anyway, okay, so 1823. The Supreme Court handed down a decision which stated that Indians could occupy lands within the United States, but they could not hold title to those lands. So Native Americans can occupy lands, but they cannot hold title to those lands. Their reasoning was because the Native American right of occupancy was subordinate to the United States right of discovery. In response to this great threat, the Creeks, the Cherokee, and the Chickasaw instituted policies of restricting land sales to the government. They wanted to protect what remained of their land before it was too late. Now, I know we talked about how Native Americans didn't see land as something that could be owned, but let's push that a little bit deeper. It's the idea of private ownership. So we do see Native Americans with their tribes. They're pretty territorial, but it's about the resources on the land, not necessarily the land itself. Although the 5 Indian nations had made earlier attempts at resistance, many of their strategies were nonviolent. One method was to adopt Anglo-American practices such as large-scale farming, Western education, and slaveholding. This earned the nations the designation of the 5 civilized tribes. They adopted this policy of assimilation in an attempt to coexist with settlers as well as to ward off hostility, but it only wound up making whites jealous and resentful. The Cherokee, in particular, used legal means in their attempt to safeguard their rights. They sought protection from white settlers who continually harassed them by stealing their livestock, burning their towns, and squatting on their lands. In 1827, the Cherokee adopted a written constitution declaring themselves to be a sovereign nation. Doesn't that sound familiar? They based this on U.S. policy. In former treaties, Indian nations had been declared sovereign so they would be made legally capable of ceding their lands. Now the Cherokee hoped to use the status to their advantage. The state of Georgia, however, did not recognize their sovereign status, but saw them as tenants living on state land. The Cherokee then took their case to the Supreme Court, which ruled against them. The Cherokee went to the Supreme Court again in 1831. This time they based their appeal on an 1830 Georgia law which prohibited whites from living on Indian territory after March 31st, 1831, without a license from the state. The state legislature had written this law to justify removing white missionaries who were helping the Indians resist removal. The court this time decided in favor of the Cherokee. It stated that the Cherokee had the right to self-government and declared Georgia's extension of state law over them to be unconstitutional. The state of Georgia refused to abide by the court decision, and President Jackson refused to enforce the law. So in 1830, just a year after Jackson took office, he pushed a new piece of legislation called the Indian Removal Act through both houses of Congress. It gave the president power to negotiate removal treaties with Indian tribes living east of the Mississippi River. Under these treaties, Indians were to give up their lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for lands to the west. Those wishing to remain in the east would become citizens of their home state, so they would not be considered sovereign citizens of a sovereign nation within the United States. Oh no, they have to be citizens of that particular state. This act affected not only the southeastern nations, but many others farther north. The removal was supposed to be voluntary and peaceful, and it was that way for the tribes that agreed to the conditions. But the southeastern nations resisted, and Jackson forced them to leave. The Chickasaws had seen removal as inevitable, so they didn't resist. They signed a treaty in 1832 which stated that the federal government would provide them with suitable western lands and would protect them until they moved. But, once again, the onslaught of white settlers proved too much for the War Department, and it backed down on its promise. The Chickasaws were forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their western allotment. So they migrated there in the winter of 1837 and 38. The Cherokee, on the other hand, were tricked with an illegitimate treaty. In 1833, a small faction agreed to sign a removal agreement, the Treaty of New Eshota. The leaders of this group were not the recognized leaders of the Cherokee Nation, and over 15,000 Cherokees, led by Chief John Ross, signed a petition in protest. The Supreme Court ignored their demands and ratified the treaty in 1836. The Cherokee were given 2 years to migrate voluntarily, at the end of which time they would be forcibly removed. By 1838, only 2,000 had migrated. 16,000 remained on their land, so the U.S. government sent in 7,000 troops who forced the Cherokees into stockades at Bayonet Point. They were not allowed time to gather their things, and as they left, whites were looting their homes. Then began the very long march known as the Trail of Tears, in which 4,000 Cherokee people died. They died of cold, of hunger, as well as disease on their way to western lands. By 1837, the Jackson administration had removed 46,000 Native American people from their land east of the Mississippi and had secured treaties which led to the removal of a slightly larger number. You can see in the map at the bottom right the different trails that Native Americans were taking, and the Trail of Tears being one of the most prominent. So, Andrew Jackson, the man of the people, or at least people who are like him. Okay, so Jackson's inauguration celebration proved unlike that of any previous president. Long before 1829, Washington, D.C. had developed a code of proper behavior for such occasions, and Jackson pretty much invited everybody to the inauguration party. So there was a very rowdy crowd that mobbed the White House to cheer on the new president, which left the city's social arbiters aghast, one author put it. Many of those attending the inauguration were looking for jobs. Jackson mentioned a rotation in office, which was the dismissal of rival party office holders and installment of political supporters in their places in his inaugural address. Although he did not invent the practice, he endorsed the rotation that his critics called the spoils system, and his administration became identified with it. But Jackson did not make wholesale replacements when he became president, and the turnover during his 2 terms was rather modest. In any event, he relied more heavily on political allies, newspaper editors, and friends for advice. The only member of his informal advisory group, which is called the Kitchen Cabinet, who came from within the government was the Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren. During Jackson's presidency, more money was spent annually on developing the nation's infrastructure than under Adams. The nullification controversy is one of many issues that Andrew Jackson faced. To Southerners who depended more on imports than any other region of the country, the tariff of 1828 was both discriminatory and unconstitutional. Calhoun responded to it by drafting the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, which introduced the idea that states had the right to nullify, which is to refuse to obey, to nullify any law passed by Congress they considered unjust. Jackson supported protective tariffs, but agreed to a slight reduction in rates in 1832. The change did not go far enough for Calhoun. He resigned the vice presidency in protest and returned to South Carolina, whose legislature very quickly sent him back to Washington as a senator. Calhoun claimed that the only tariff permitted by the Constitution was one that raised money for the common good. Tariffs that adversely affected the economy of one part of the nation, aka the South, while benefiting other regions, aka New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, were unconstitutional. In November 1832, South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification that forbade customs duties from being collected in its port cities under the new tariff. Jackson wasted no time in moving against South Carolina. He proclaimed nullification itself unconstitutional and stressed that the Constitution had created a single nation rather than a group of states. So that's really important. Put a star next to that. Jackson proclaimed nullification unconstitutional, and, this is the part with the star, stressed that the Constitution had created a single nation, not a group of states. A single nation, not a group of states. And then he threatened to use force to collect the customs duties. The forts in Charleston Harbor were put on alert by the Secretary of War, and federal troops in South Carolina were prepared for action. Military confrontation was prevented through the efforts of Henry Clay, who for the second time in his career achieved a major political compromise. Congress passed two bills in March 1833, both approved by Jackson, that ultimately diffused the situation. The compromise tariff gradually reduced duties over a 10-year period, and the force bill authorized the president to enforce federal law in South Carolina by military means if necessary. Oops, sorry, my chair turned. South Carolina withdrew its tariff nullification ordinance, and the solution was general enough that Jackson and Calhoun both claimed the victory. In this, we can see Andrew Jackson giving more power to the presidency than ever before, which we can see playing out further down the line, even today. So let's look at our U.S. presidents. These are our presidents. We've talked about many of them, but because we have to kind of move along, here is our list of presidents. So George Washington, also known as the father of his country. John Adams, the Colossus of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the Sage of Monticello. James Madison, father of the Constitution, since he was sort of the main author. I only put in the ones that I liked, the nicknames that I liked. So John Quincy Adams, Old Man Eloquent, very good speaker. Andrew Jackson, known as Old Hickory. William Henry Harrison, known as Old Tippecanoe. We'll hear that story later. And John Tyler, known as His Excellency, and Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready. So we're going to stop here for this video presentation. I will make another one to finish out this particular lecture series, and then we'll pick up again with the Civil War.